I'm a hunter. I like to hunt wild boar, specifically. Though I have been deer hunting and have been known to get turkey for Thanksgiving, I mostly hunt boar. For those of you who don't know, boar is a big problem in the United States. A sow can have 2 litters a year, and it's not uncommon for a litter to consist of 10 or more pigs. Given that pigs eat anything and everything, is not hard to see why the Department of Fish and Wildlife makes it legal to hunt them, with almost no restrictions. In my state, it's illegal to hunt most large mammals with night or thermal vision scopes, with the exception of boar and coyote. I've been saving for a year and mostly fun money. It's hard to explain to your wife that a scope that costs literally twice as much as a rifle. I was mounting on it, so it was worth it. But I did it. I took it to a range and sighted in. There was an area that was peppered with boar activity that I knew would be perfect for a night hunt. It was easily accessible with my truck, with easy to find spots that I could set up in the overlook, a large, easy to navigate clearing. The night started uneventful, mostly me tinkering with a new toy, cycling through the settings. I was a little impatient. I spotted multiple deer, but they were out of season, and like I mentioned earlier, my current setup wasn't legal for deer. I moved to another spot that I'd seen days earlier that probably wasn't much better than my first, but it gave me something to do and a new angle to look around with my new scope. After an hour or so of glassing the area, it dawned on me. This spot doesn't have much animal activity at all. No rabbits, no owls or deer that I've seen hundreds of yards from where I was. Why was it this pocket of land so dead at night but lively in the day? I set up around 10 p.m. and it was about 2 in the morning when I started to think about packing up, maybe setting up a new target before I left and taking some practice shots. I heard a crunch coming from the direction where I came from. I panned my scope over and saw the silhouette of a small bear pushing through the bushes. It's important to note that my scope isn't exactly night vision. It's a thermal scope, kind of like a black and white version of what you see in Predator movies. I adjusted the range and zoomed in a little. I remember jolting a little bit when I saw that it wasn't really a bear. It was a man. Because he was so low and hunched over, I thought I was looking at a younger bear. Is that a game warden? It couldn't be. I would have seen the headlights come up in the road from where I was perched. And where could he walk from? I was 30 miles away from anything on a public land. I was about to call out, and when I adjusted my sights and noticed that he was naked, no shoes, pants, or anything, I remember being disturbed by his movements, like a squirrel or something, twitchy and grabbed the foliage, sniffing around and palming the tree. Was that my tree? The one I'd been leaning against earlier? The thought of it terrified me. Could he smell me? Then he did something I still have nightmares about today. He squatted and placed his hands in the dirt between his feet and stared straight up like a dog mid-howl. And I heard it. A voice coming from the direction. A very convincing female voice. "Help! I'm lost." There was a long pause, but neither of us moved a muscle. The center of my sight was trained at the dirt in front of his feet. I couldn't bring myself to aim anywhere else other than the person. It was against everything I'd been taught about firearms. Were they lost? Was this some guy that had been gone crazy out here? Why was his voice so feminine? "Help! Please! I can't walk," the voice called out. That's when I called BS. Not only could he walk, when I first saw him, he was traversing the land with ease for a naked person. So good that I mistook him for a bear. That's an effing trap. This guy's trying to lure me in with a damsel in distress routine. Luckily, the lack of activity had been causing me to pack up most of my gear. I think I may have left behind a hat and a sitting pad, but I didn't give a crap about that in the moment. I took my eyes off him for a moment to get my pack on. I buckled my chest strap and scrambled for my rifle. To my horror, he was in the same position, but his face was staring in my direction, and I swear I saw a smile. The thermoscope had an effect that makes animals' eyes appear white. How the heck did he hear me get up and put on my gear? It must have been like 150 yards away. Stay away, I screamed in the direction. He stood upright, and it hit me how tall and skinny he was, easily 6 feet and very lean. He took a couple of long strides in my direction. I instinctively sent a round sailing above his head into a tree line. He was freaky as heck, but he hadn't really threatened me. What would I tell the cops? I was unwilling and unready to shoot someone. He stopped dead in his tracks and hunched down on all fours. The next one will mess you up. Go away. He stayed on all fours, and this time I had my sights trained on the center of him. His eyes were just above the grass like a large cat or something. I was trying to stop my trembling and knew that my voice had cracked a little on the last warning. I was terrified. That standoff probably lasted a minute or two, maybe less, but it felt like forever. In an instant, he bolted left towards the tree line opposite of the road. So much for not being able to walk. I could barely keep up with him on my scope. He was moving so fast. He disappeared into the bush, and I sent another bullet sailing high in its direction. I racked another round and tried to pocket the mag and swap out for a fresh one, but I dropped it, and I didn't bother looking for it. I wasn't far from my truck, and I wanted to get out of there. I could hear him still in the distance, yelling in this weird sound that could have been laugh or a cry. I scrambled up the trail and arrived at my truck, breathless. I tossed my gear into the cab and kept my rifle in the passenger seat and sped off. For the longest time, I told that story from the perspective of having spotted some deranged crackhead living off of the land like some kind of caveman. I reported to the fish and game, but all they did was scold me for hunting at night alone. I've never received an update. It wasn't until I told the story at a camping trip that my nephew told me about wendigos, rakes, and skinwalkers. My story scared the crap out of him because the spot that we were camping on was technically the same forest I seen that guy, just 50 miles east of it. He was so spooked that his mom, my cousin, had to take him home. She was really mad. I've gone down the rabbit hole on these stories. I'm not saying that I definitely saw what wendigo or a skinwalker. I'm saying that if such thing exists, I may have dodged a bullet on that night. Or maybe it was just a tweaker being a Donnie Thornberry in the middle of the night. Either way, I thought I would share the story with you. Before I begin, I would like to say that this is a very long story. It's been something that haunted me since I was 6 years old, since my first encounter with it. I've had bad dreams about this and 2 very specific encounters with this creature. I'm sharing the story so I can possibly find some help on what to do or how to get rid of this creature that's been hunting me ever since I can remember. Just for background, I'm a 21-year-old female. I still worry about this creature finding me, but I'll get into detail why later. But for now, here's my story. I would always go camping with my grandparents, who I call my Grammy and Grampy. At the end of my school years, I would always look forward to it since I grew up loving the outdoors. in the woods. I especially love camping, loving the idea of having s'mores, taking long hikes, being around the campfire, and of course, the wildlife. Now, I grew up in California, mostly near cities, so the forest was like my true home to me. I've always preferred being near trees and dirt, rather than buildings and crowded places. Besides, the woods were much quieter and more peaceful. I always felt safe on where I was, like nothing could ever hurt me. But something strange would always happen by the end of the month of May. I would have this reoccurring dream during the last week of school year. I would be in the woods, walking alone down a dirt trail. The woods were always strangely quiet. I would continue to walk on this path until I saw this red fox poke his head out from behind a tree. The eyes were always strangely human-like, but they were yellow and somehow looked like a teddy bear eyes. And it would just stare at me. It wouldn't make a sound at all. It would just watch me. Usually in my dream, I would go up there and just pet it. That making the fox finally make some noise, usually a soft growl. Then I would continue walking, and it would follow me. The first time I would have this dream when I was actually around 5 years old. It lasted until I was about maybe perhaps 11. Over the years, it would be the exact same thing. I would walk into the woods, find this fox, pet it, then continue my hike with it alongside me. But about having this dream for the fourth time, it would start to walk behind me. That's when I started to feel uneasy about this fox. I could hear it making odd noises, but every time I would look back, it was just even walking like nothing was wrong. Even somehow, it gave me a smile. I'm sorry about going on about a dream, but I believe that this was some type of warning of the creature. Now that the dream is out there and out of the way, I could talk about my first true encounter. When I was about 6 years old and was going through a camping trip with my Grammy and Grampy for about a week. Of course, I was very excited for it, being able to barely keep myself in my school seat for the last day of kindergarten. They had picked me up right as the bell rang and already had the camping trailer attached to Grampy's truck. I remember he drove on an old red truck that had about 3 seats, me always being in the middle. It took about 2 hours to get there, and around a good hour to find our usual camping spot. It was deep into the woods and far from other people, as my Grammy wasn't too fond of being around other people while he camped. As they were setting up the camp trailer, I wandered around the campsite, loving to dig in the dirt for bugs. I had sat down on the dirt and started to dig, but I noticed how strangely quiet the woods were. It was never quiet, not even the dead of night. I thought it was odd, but being only 6, I didn't think too hard about it. As I continued to dig for bugs, however, I thought I heard Grammy call for me. She would usually call me Sugar Booger, that being a nickname she gave me since I was born. That's what I had heard, but it sounded like she was very far away and somewhat sick. Sugar Booger. I look up where it came from, that from being the woods, but there was no way she was there because she was still unloading stuff from the truck. Even at the age of 6, I didn't feel right, so I walked closer to my grandparents and stayed next to them. I soon forgot about my weird encounter. Though, as we began to have fun, for the rest of the day, we played card games, sat next to the campfire as we ate dinner, and stared up into the stars. I always loved seeing the stars. They were never being anywhere where I lived at. We started to get sleepy around 9 p.m., I believe, and we started to get ready for bed. There were bunk beds that me and Grammy would sleep on, keeping our luggage on top bunk, and we would sleep on the bottom bunk. Due to my Grampy snoring, he would sleep on the couch of the trailer. I would always sleep next to the trailer window, just in case I couldn't sleep and wanted to look outside. I fell asleep pretty quickly though, that being the last day of school and all. It was pretty exhausting. I remember waking up maybe hours later, It was still pitch black outside. It wasn't weird for me to wake up late in the night, since I always had sleeping issues. I rolled onto my side, trying to fall back asleep until I heard, "Sugar booger." My eyes immediately shot open as I heard my nickname being spoken, but I knew it wasn't either of my grandparents. They were both asleep. I never were known to sleep talk before. I started to feel this horrible feeling in my gut, like whatever I was hearing wanted to really hurt me. Even at the age of 6, I knew that this wasn't normal. Then I started to hear tapping on the trailer window. It was soft, but loud enough for me to hear it. Tap, tap, tap. I just sat there, frozen in fear. I was trying to brush it off as a tree branch or rain, but I just knew that it wasn't it. I could tell that it was actually someone or something tapping on the window. Then I decided to be brave and look outside. Big mistake. I pulled the curtain away to only peek, and all I saw were these large yellow eyes. They seemed glassy, yet not entirely real. They looked like a giant teddy bear eyes, but cold and unwelcoming. I remember in that moment I panicked and quickly closed the curtain back up. I then hid under the blanket, that being the only thing I knew what to do when I saw the monster. I could feel tears falling down my face. I've never been so terrified in my life. I just curled up into my Grammy's side and clung to her all night. The damn tapping only got louder and more persistent throughout the night. I don't remember falling asleep, but somehow I did. I do remember my grampy waking me up around noon, saying how if I don't get up quick enough, we could still go fishing. I honestly didn't want to leave the trailer at all, terrified of whatever I saw that night before we would be out there. I did eventually go outside, but I was constantly looking around, horrified of whatever saw me last night would get me. My Grammy knew immediately that I was scared of something and pulled me in for a hug when she saw me, asking me what was wrong. I told her what I saw and heard, and surprisingly, she believed me. Next thing I knew, she was telling my grandpa that we were moving campsites. It took a bit to convince him, but he did eventually start to pack up and hook the trailer onto his truck. I was put into the truck so I could properly sleep. But I just couldn't. I kept feeling that I was being watched, thinking that every little noise was that thing I saw, that if I closed my eyes, even for a second, it would get me. My Grammy wasn't too far from me when I heard it again, but this time, it was my actual name. Aaliyah. In that moment, I've never seen my Grammy move so fast. She looked up into the bushes where we heard it. Then to me. Then she got me into the truck with me, pulled me into a tight, protective hug. I began to cry all over again, telling her I wanted to just go back home. That's when my grandpa got into the truck as well. And since I was sobbing so hard to the point that I was coughing, he agreed that we would just go home. We started to head out of the campsite. Still hurt that this trip had to be ruined by something, but I still didn't know what. That's when something in the back of my head told me to look back. I slowly did, feeling an ice-cold fear wash over me as I saw something. A red fox, sitting in the middle of the campsite, sitting there with large, yellow eyes. The same red fox from my dream, somehow curling its lips into an eerie smile. After that encounter, we didn't go back to the campsite. We did continue to camp, but in a more populated area. I didn't tell my grandma what I saw, but she told me to trust my gut. She knew that I was sensitive to certain entities, and that would help me if I trusted. Now, this would be the end of the story, but I'm afraid it's not. There was one more encounter I had with the creature, and it was much more terrifying than the first one. The second encounter I had when I was 17 years old, many years later. By this time, I knew very well what a skinwalker was now, and I was still very paranoid every time I went near wooded areas. I still worry about seeing that fox, but I never really thought about it too much. Me and my two younger siblings were staying at a relative's house for Christmas, them living way up into the mountain area. I think they were my great aunt and uncle, but I'm not too sure. Where they live, there was no service at all, so unless we hook them to the Wi-Fi, we had no phones. I didn't mind the house, still loving the woods no matter what happened. Though, at night, I hated how we didn't close the window curtains, making it easy to anything outside to see the inside. But I did feel safe while inside the house, knowing that they wouldn't let anything hurt us kids. Luckily, it didn't snow where they lived, so we can go outside and run around. They always had this beautiful black lab, being about a 1-year-old named Pam. She was very playful and normally wouldn't listen to anyone but my uncle. Although she was easily excitable, she was a good puppy. One of the days we were there, my little sister and our aunt went out into the store for a nice girls' day. Although I am a girl, I wanted to go hiking with my uncle and my little brother. We left pretty early since the hike we were doing was about a 4-hour walk into town. It was a really chilly morning, but since we were doing much walking, it felt great. We also decided to take Pam, it being a good way for her to get some exercise and maybe have some fun. About maybe an hour into our walk, I started to slow down a bit, wanting to enjoy the beautiful forest. It was so peaceful. I could have honestly stayed there, but we continued to walk. I started to feel something unsettling, and noticed how quiet the forest had become suddenly, hearing only our footsteps, and my brother talking to my uncle. Pam noticed it too, her ears going straight up and growling softly. I started to pick up my pace to get next to my brother, worried that possibly a coyote or a mountain lion was nearby. I knew though that it wouldn't be out there at this time. Even if they were, they didn't walk near the roads. My little brother was only 9 at the time, and being the oldest sibling, my natural instincts to protect him kicked in. My uncle noticed the silence as well, letting us stay close to him and Pam, who was now next to me and still growling. I began to feel this horrible feeling again, that ice-cold fear I once felt when I was 6 years old. I tried so hard to not think about the creature, but it was all that I could worry about. I was scared. I felt like I was still back to being that scared 6-year-old again. I had to stop for a moment, seeing my shoelace came undone. I quickly kneeled down to tie it back up, trying to hurry just to get out of there. That's when I heard it. Aaliyah. In that moment, my heart dropped into my stomach. My eyes were widened, and I could just feel myself start to shake from fear. It It was right next to me. I heard it clear as day. I slowly turned my head, and there it was. That same red fox. Still having those horrid yellow eyes, and that same demented smile. Only this time, I saw it much more clearly. The fur looked matted and disgusting. The smell it had was like rotten, decaying flesh mixed with garbage. The limbs were much too long for a normal fox. The back legs bending completely the wrong way. Those eyes were still the worst thing about it, but now they looked emptier than I had remembered. I wanted to scream. No, I wanted to run and cry, but I just couldn't. I was frozen as I was, too scared to even blink. Then I heard it speak again. This time, it had mimicked my little brother's voice. I found you. Before anything else could happen, Pam suddenly jumped in front of me and started to bark like mad, snapping and growling so aggressively that it scared me out of my frozen trance. When I looked back, it was gone. I used that moment to run over to my brother and uncle, who didn't see what I saw as they were too far away ahead now. As I heard my uncle start to pray and sing a song under his breath, keeping my brother and myself close to him. I was just too scared to even look back, so I kept my eyes to the ground and refused to stop walking. Pam had stopped barking, but she was still growling loudly and never left my side as we continued our hike. My little brother was a bit worried, but he just thought it was a coyote. When we finally made it into town, my uncle had called our aunt and told her to pick us up, saying something about it was unsafe to walk back. Thankfully, she did come get us, but she was confused since we talked about the hike for days. On the car ride back, Pam never left my side. She was right with me the entire time. She knew that thing was right after me, and she protected me. I was very grateful that she was with us. Who knows what would have happened if she wasn't. When we got back to the house, I was talked to by my uncle and aunt. Once I told them what happened and what I saw, they started to pray and check all the locks and make sure that everything was shut tight. My aunt was putting something around the doors. I now believe that was probably ashes, but I never did find out. Unfortunately, this made our Christmas vacation cut short, as they were worried that I was not safe while I was still in the woods. We had to be taken home the next day, them making an excuse of how there was an emergency with a friend and they had to help them out. I felt horrible that this Christmas was ruined, but once I did leave the woods, I truly felt safe again. Before they had to drive me back home though, they told me that it wasn't my fault, and that luckily it didn't hurt me or the other kids. It did make me feel a bit better, but it still brought up a lot of questions and worries. It was still around. How? Why? What did it want with me? Does it want my skin? My soul? Was I just going to be tormented by this thing forever? I still don't have my answers to these questions, and that's what really scares me. Now, I've long moved from California, and now I live in Kentucky. I do live in the woods, but so far, the thing hasn't found me. I know that seems pretty stupid of me, on my part, but life had changed me a lot when I was growing up. I was given no other option to live somewhere else but with my grandpa in Kentucky. My grandpa was nice enough to let me live with him, so please don't call me an idiot for moving to the woods when I had no other choice. Anyways, While I am happy that it hasn't found me, I'm still worried. Can it still find me? Is it still hunting me? I am not close to anyone who truly knows how to get rid of this thing. But that's why I'm telling my story now, so I can possibly get some help. So please, if there's anyone out there who knows, please help me. True story. I used to stay at my grandparents' house a lot when I was younger. They wanted to help out and such. They owned a 50 to 40 acre farm with their house about a quarter mile into the woods. It was summer and we were all going to bed. I always had trouble falling asleep and was the only one awake, and was returning from the bathroom to join my cousin on top of the bunk with me in the bottom. The bedroom had one window facing a light post where my grandparents had installed it. I was just covering myself when I saw something cast a shadow against the window curtain. Once, then twice. It was fast, but I could tell that there was something moving outside. I crawled out of the bed, hugging the floor, already scared. I was about a foot from the closed curtain, with my eye just above the windowsill. I stared out and nothing happened for a few seconds. Then I saw a figure cast a shadow into the curtain. It looked like a big dog's head. Long snout tail, pointed ears. It stopped perfectly center of the window frame, then slowly turned its head to face me. I froze, but then it raised a few inches to show its shoulders. I can only describe it as a wolf head on a human body. Then it turned away and moved on. People say that I was young and it was only a nightmare. It wasn't. I remember that it was so vividly. I forgot to mention that this window was about 5 feet from the ground. It was my mother's old room as a child, and when I asked her if she saw anything, she paused for several seconds, began to speak, shook her head, and stuttered. No. She knew the folklore and refused to speak about it. Eventually, we dropped it, but I knew why she responded that way. You're never supposed to mention the name out loud. I can't explain this, but I'm still scared about being alone there at night. Even when I'm typing this, it still gives me goosebumps. To give some perspective on the scenario, we live in an apartment complex at the edge of town of Illinois, right next to its woodsy area full of coyotes and deer, and lots of birds, so it's pretty lively. Last night at 3 a.m., she went outside to grab a case of water from the trunk of our car. And when she was grabbing it, she claimed that she heard someone saying, "Hello?" in a girl's voice, coming from the woods. She couldn't see anything, but she replied back confused, saying, "Hello back." Whatever it was, it ended up saying, "Can somebody help me?" And that's when she got chills and ran as fast as she could inside her house. Right before she entered the house, she said she heard it again, from the voice getting closer, asking for help, but instead of a normal girl's voice, it turned into a girl's voice that didn't even sound like it was real. And she just couldn't explain it, but the voice just changes pitch a bit. Plus, she said afterwards, thinking about it, that her voice sounded familiar, but couldn't point out whose voice it belonged to. Why I believe that she wasn't BSing is because 2 years living here, We've never talked things about things like this. And when she rushed inside, she startled me because her face was in shock and she was breathing heavily. Like I thought that she'd seen something or heard a gunshot. I don't know, something disturbing. My question is, she thinks that it was a skinwalker because who would be out there at 3 in the morning asking for someone to help them in the woods? What do you guys think? I also read online that you aren't supposed to interact nor share the encounter you had with the skinwalker. She will be alright after this one, sharing this story, I hope. I don't know how many people will read this or how many will believe it, and frankly, I really don't care. All I know is that this really did happen, and my brother knows it, and even law enforcement believes some of it. I even have pictures that I will upload if this gets any attention. This happened on a ranch that my brother and I lease in eastern Montana. If you'd like more information, you will have to private message me. Let's get on with the story. The ranch in question is massive, covering over 18 sections. Its section is 1 square mile, or 640 acres. And this is 2/3 deeded, with the rest being either BLM or state-owned. This land is incredibly rugged, being covered in clay hills and deep canyons, and is for the most part unfenced. There are several buffalo jumps on the ranch, while hundreds of years ago, the Indians would chase herds of buffalo off cliffs to their deaths. You can still find buffalo bones at these sites. Supposedly, the ranch was also the site of a massacre where an entire village of Hidatsa were killed by their enemies, the Sioux. Although I actually haven't found any actual records of the incident. Also, on the ranch are about 2 abandoned homesteads on the ranch. The Mintz Place and a Carter Place. These are fake names as the families still live on the area, and I would like to keep their information private. The Mintz homestead is merely 1 mile off the country road and relatively easy to access. So my brother and I still use the dated cattle pens that are a part of it. The Carter Place is more remote, however, only be accessible on horseback as a trail that went onto it washed out many years ago. All that is left of the Carter Place is a log cabin with a roof caving in, an old corral system, and a barn that was toppled over. The last people that lived in the Carter house was the Carter family themselves, but during the 1930s, the father went crazy and murdered the entire family before turning the gun on himself. At least that's what people said. The ranch's current owner lived on California and have owned the ranch since purchasing it from the Mist family sometime during the 1980s. My father and I began leasing the ranch in 2007. There are some unusual activity at first, mainly random lights, but nothing that couldn't be explained in a reasonable way. The strangeness began in 2017, after a well was drilled on the property. I wonder now if this may have unleashed something. During the fall of 2017, I was searching for strays on horseback when I was approached by 2 frantic hunters. These hunters claimed that they were being stalked by a pack of wolves, but I was dismissive, as there had not been any wolf in the area since the 1920s. The hunters claimed that they knew the difference between wolves and coyotes, and were absolutely certain that what was stalking them was wolves. Whatever it was, it seriously bothered them. Later in the year, when we were trucking cattle away from the ranch and back to the home place, we found out that there were about a dozen head short. Despite us running around 600 cattle on the property, we kept very close tabs on the herd, and it wasn't unusual to lose more than 2. But no matter how many times we searched and recounted, we could not find the missing cattle. This began a trend. And so far in 2017, 138 unaccounted cattle, a financial loss of $165,000. Though there were many other events that I could have recounted, there is one that stands out. This took place in October of 2020. Myself, my brother, and my brother's eldest son were gathering the cattle and herding them to the Mid's homestead, where they could be loaded onto trucks and taken to our home ranch for the winter. By this point, the weird activity on the ranch had increased. So much so that we've never went to the ranch without being armed. This day was no exception. And strapped to the saddle, under my left legs, was a Winchester .30-30 rifle. The morning went well, and by noon, we gathered 200 head, which we penned up in the Mid's place. After eating a quick lunch, my brother and nephew loaded up their horses and left. My nephew had a football game later that day. I stayed alone and rode northwest toward the Carter homestead. The first strange thing to happen was when I rode down a canyon. As I was riding, I could hear multiple howls and cries coming from all directions. I couldn't describe what these howls sounded like because they were like nothing that I've ever heard or since. As I continued riding into the canyon, I was overcome with a feeling of dread. My horse, Ace, seemed to pick up on this as well. It began spooking at almost every shadow. This was very out of character for him, as he is usually a very calm and collected horse. The second strange thing was when I approached the Carter homestead. As I crested a hill in front of it, something jumped out of the old cabin and ran into the opposite direction. I was still close to a mile away, so I had to use my binoculars to get a better look. What I saw through the lens chilled me to the bone. It was a wolf, but it was massive and solid black like a shadow. It was so large that it could have been mistaken for a black bear, but it was so undeniably a canine. After seeing the wolf, my gut told me to turn around and come back later with company, but I ultimately continued. Throughout the course of the afternoon, I managed to convince myself that it was a wolf, and that I saw nothing else but more than a coyote. And its black fur was just a shadow. It was nearing dusk before I arrived back to the Mid's place, herding 30 head of cattle in front of me. After I penned up the cattle up, I led Ace back to the pickup and horse trailer. From a distance, I could see that there was something wrong with the trailer. And as I approached, I found the axle had come apart. It didn't make any sense to me. It was fine when I drove in, and there was no explanation as what I could have done to make it fall apart when it wasn't moving. By this time, it was fairly dark outside, and as we were coming out the next day, I decided to unhook the trailer and leave Ace at the corrals overnight. When I left, I saw 3 blue lights near the corrals, but I attributed these lights to hunters, so I continued driving. I also heard some more of the howls I heard early that day. When all three of us arrived the next morning, we found the corrals in a total mess. All of the grass was turned up inside the corral where the cattle had been milling, and the fence was broken into several places. The cattle that were penned up in the night were now nowhere to be found, along with Ace. My brother and nephew took off on a horseback to try to locate some of the cattle and Ace, but only managed to find about 20 head. As I was without a horse, we repaired the trailer and left later into the afternoon. The next day, all three of us rode, and we searched exclusively for Ace. During this time, I covered a lot of country that I would otherwise miss, and I discovered more bizarre things. At the bottom of one canyon were hundreds of holes, about 1 foot in diameter and 1 foot deep. These holes had been dug by people, as there were no animal that could have dug them. I also found a bone pile, which was exceptionally strange. There were the carcass of 4 cows, all piled on top of each other, in an area where they typically would not have accessed. At first, I thought this was an act of poachers who were illegally killing and butchering cattle at the ranch. But there had been no way to get this location with a pickup or a 4-wheeler for that matter. The more we searched, the less sense we made. We searched for 3 days before we came across anything. My brother radioed me, as there was no radio service, that he believed that he found my horse, Ace. My nephew and I rode to this location, and sure enough, at the bottom of a sinkhole. Sinkholes are very common in this area, so its presence was not unusual. There was the carcass of Ace, along with 3 cows. The sinkhole was at the bottom of the canyon, with the walls of this canyon being 300 feet high. The sinkhole being between 20 feet deep. It took an hour just to climb down the canyon walls. When I finally approached the sinkhole, I found Ace to be heavily damaged. Both ears were removed, along with the eyes, nostrils, and hooves. The back half of him was not exposed, but it looked like his tail was also removed. The cows surrounding him also had similar damage as well. As was the case with the howls, the wolf, and the trailer, none of this made sense. It would have been almost impossible for 1 cow to end up in this location, let alone 3 cows and a horse. There were also no tracks leading to or out of the sinkholes or canyon. The sheriff and veterinarian were both notified, and an investigation was launched. The ultimate conclusion was that something had caused the cattle to be spooked and break out of the corrals, and whatever it was that spooked them so bad that they all ran away from the midst place to the bottom of the sinkhole, in which they all perished. When I mentioned the wolf that I had seen, they were dismissive. It just had been one of the hunters that told me about the wolf 3 years prior. No foul play was suspected. The case was closed. Though there were many strange things that happened since then, there was none quite as upsetting as the loss of my horse. Cattle continue to go missing, and we now only ride the place in pairs. My brother and I are thinking about terminating the lease, as for the moment, the current cattle losses are unsustainable. I've always been a big YouTube watcher and found that many stories on the site came from Reddit, so I decided to share mine. though I don't have many pictures of Ace in the sinkhole. My phone was destroyed in an unrelated incident, and I didn't have my files backed up. I do have a picture of separate bone piles in some of the ranch. I will post these on my profile if you're interested in seeing them.